Hey there. Today I want to dive deep on waveform clarity. What is the loudest, clearest waveform? And I'm going to run some experiments where we compare the loudness and headroom for different waveforms. In particular, I want to show that the phase relationship between harmonics is important for having the loudest signal with the most headroom. And let me be straightforward that this video is more about mixing than it is about sound design, because we aren't going to be really creating any finished synth patches, just running some experiments, but hopefully you can learn some information that helps you get clearer mixes. So let's be a little more specific about what I mean by waveform clarity, because I'm sort of making up that term to describe something I found useful in mixing. So we use the word clarity a lot to describe a lot of things, but for example, when we're looking at like an entire mix down where we're combining all the tracks together, clarity might be talking about how we're like separating the different tracks so we can hear them all individually, and we can hear each instrument clearly. So that would be when we're really concerned about masking and different frequencies competing for the same space, when we're kind of talking at like the top level of mixing, or like the macro scale. But today I want to specifically look at the micro scale or low level aspects for clarity. And in this case, I particularly want to optimize the loudness and headroom of our waveforms. So loudness and clarity aren't the same things, but they're definitely related, because when sounds are louder, we hear them more clearly. That's just the way our ears work. And headroom is important because essentially if we have more headroom in our waveform, where like the headroom is how much distance is left from our waveform's peak to the like maximum peak around 0 decibels that our track allows. The more headroom we have, the more space we have, not only for increasing the gain of the waveform itself to get more loudness out of it, but it also just gives us more space to layer other tracks in. So if we can optimize headroom, we're just setting us up downstream for the macro level mixing, where we have more space to mix in other sounds. So first, let's kind of just do like a thought experiment, which just helps us get in the right mindset of how to analyze this. So what is the loudest possible waveform? And let's add some constraints, because first off, we're talking about the mixing stage of a song. So we're not going to be talking about changing the pitch of the waveform to optimize loudness. Like technically our ears do hear loudness differently across the frequency spectrum. So it'd be true that like we could find some pitch that sounds louder to us, but that's not what we're talking about. That kind of breaks the rules, since we're not going to be like mixing our bass and put it all the way in the treble register just to optimize the loudness. Not only would we be getting all sorts of masking problems if we put all our tracks in the same register, but it's also just like not musical. Like we want bass, like we want really high frequencies. We want to use the whole spectrum. So it's against the rules of this thought experiment to change the pitch, as well as doing sort of waveform effects which implicitly change the pitch. Like we can explicitly change the pitch by playing different notes on the keyboard. Like that's one way to change the pitch, but we can also do these effects which sort of implicitly pitch it, like this sing. Like that's essentially changing the register of our sound. So for this thought experiment against the rules, as well as if you add upper harmonics with more amplitude than the fundamental, you're essentially changing the pitch. Like that's no longer really in the bass register. So you like sounds that have a defined pitch, all the harmonics are below the fundamental, and they sort of all like decay. Like you're usually not going to have any big spikes like this. So that's against the rules. So that's sort of the thought experiment I'm setting up for how we'd want to optimize this. If you think I'm like missing something, just let me know in the chat. But how would we even measure this? So we're going to talk about loudness in units of LUFS, which is a commonly used metric for quantifying loudness. And we can monitor it nicely with this plugin, FabFilter Pro L2. I also have minimeters, but the metrics are just kind of tiny. So for like a tutorial, let's look at these this metric in FabFilter Pro L2. And we're also going to be talking about peak amplitude, which is our proxy for headroom. So that shows up right here in FabFilter Pro L2. So like this sawtooth. It's coming in with a peak of minus 3.4 decibels, and its LUFS is around minus 12 LUFS. So that's how we would say, like, we have, minus 3.4 decibels of headroom, and we have minus 12 LUFS for this saw wave. Now I've kind of set up how we'd measure this loudness and peak amplitude for each waveform, and the brute force method for this experiment would be to like try every possible waveform in Serum and write this all down, and we'd get an answer, but it would take us forever. So it's impractical. We can't really just like solve this by observing a bunch of different waveforms. So instead, we're going to use more like an analytical method and solve this problem using a couple approximations or shortcuts. But I'll also show some examples to like check my work that the loudest waveform is louder than a couple other examples, at least in the basic shapes. So if we do this analytically, we really want to be focusing on optimizing the LUFS, because we're going to be like using a synth which normalizes the peak, we can normalize the peak output. So the peak's always going to be right around that minus 3 decibel mark. So we really want to find out which waveform is going to optimize our LUFS. And like, what are LUFS? If we know what they are, then we can take a step towards like optimizing them analytically. So LUFS is just an adjusted version of RMS energy, where it's adjusting the RMS energy to account for different loudness our ears observe across the frequency spectrum. So like our first approximation is, let's just say we were optimizing RMS energy instead, and put aside that kind of like the imperfections of our ears for a second. Let's just optimize RMS energy. And RMS is calculated by taking root mean squared. It's like a math equation, so the root is actually the last thing you do. So you first square the waveform, then you take its mean or average, and finally the square root, and you get the RMS. But also, this isn't like a math video, so let's not like calculate that. Let's do another approximation and use that RMS is proportional to area under the curve. And that area under the curve, Serum actually shows us nicely. It's this shaded green part, the distance from the zero crossing of our waveform and the peak, and the area that we get from that, that shape between zero crossing and the peak. That's that shaded green part. So different waveforms have different area of the curve, and that's going to be proportional with the RMS energy. So, I mean, it's just pretty easy to see that the square waveform is going to have the most area under the curve. And it's also like not too hard to imagine that it would have the highest RMS signal, just because like if we call this peak of our signal 1, any number less than 1, when you square it, is just going to get even smaller. So like our best chance at optimizing RMS is just having the signal at 1 and minus 1 the entire time. Okay, yeah, so the approximate answer is that the square wave is optimal in the most RMS energy for any particular waveform. But I promise the point of this video is not just use square waves for clarity in your mixes. Actually, there's something else about the square wave, which is this coherency in the phases, which I think is a lot more interesting or useful when we're talking about mixing techniques. And actually, all the saw is also has some like optimalness about how the different harmonics are related in their phases. So I'll get to in a little bit different mixing techniques which actually adjust that, and then we have to worry about these sharp peaks we get from the harmonics not being coherent in their phases. But before I do that, let's kind of check the work, because we just kind of waved our hands and said the square is the loudest waveform. So let's just compare it against a couple others in Serum. So the square, we still have minus 3.4 decibels of headroom, and it's peaking around minus 8 lufs. Whereas like the saw, which we had before, also peaking, we also have minus 3.4 decibels of headroom, but the lufs is at minus 12. And if we pulled up a whole bunch of waveforms, we'd see that the square is optimal. Things that look a lot like a square will also be like very close in the lufs. So like, again, the point is not just to use squares. In fact, I mean, I would definitely not recommend that. That's not my advice at all. But what like I do want to show is that the square wave is kind of like optimal because it spends so much of its time at the peak. And there are some mixing techniques which are going to change essentially this phase relationship between the signal, and that is going to cause these sharp peaks in the waveform, and we're essentially going to lose all our headroom while not increasing our lufs. Or the other way to think about that is as we lose the headroom, we can't increase the gain of our signal as much, so we essentially can't make our signal as loud. So the first thing I want to call out is OTT, which is really just a preset for multiband dynamics. And I'm not trying to pick on multiband dynamics. It's definitely has its purposes, but let's just see what that does to the waveform. So when it's turned off, our oscilloscope shows the waveform with a square wave with just a little bit of range. But when we turn this multiband dynamics on, look what happens. Totally changes the shape of the waveform. It still sounds very similar, and like, yeah, use your ears for mixing, but look what happened to our headroom. We lost almost all our headroom. So to show how this is related with loudness, like without the multiband dynamics, we had minus 3.4 decibels of headroom. So we could have boosted this by 3.4. So there we are. Now we get minus 4.7 lufs, like crazy loud. And I do have a limiter on the master, so I'm not like blowing your ears out on YouTube. But on this channel, we're measuring minus 4.7 lufs on this channel. Yeah, so that's without the multiband dynamics. With that, and with the limiter engaged where we can't cross 0 decibels, minus 6.6 lufs. So we're losing, around 2 lufs, which is also in units of decibels, 2 decibels of lufs by engaging this multiband dynamics, just because it's creating these big peaks that cause our limiter to engage. And so, yeah, I mean, limiters aren't the only way to deal with peaks. And in this case, like maybe a clipper would be a more, I don't want to say transparent, but at least maybe it's not going to adjust the loudness as drastically as the limiter. So I'm going to use, this is just like a super basic rack that maps the drive and the output inversely. So essentially we don't change the gain of our signal, but we can have different levels of saturation or clipping. even the square wave, which doesn't really change its shape, and then see what happens when we put the multiband dynamics on. Yeah, so we've shaved most of that like nasty transient that we got out of the multiband dynamics out. But now let's look at the loudness. Minus 6.7 LUFS. Minus 5.7 LUFS. So we're still using LUFS, we're still losing LUFS as we engage the multi-band dynamics, even though we're sort of clipping the transient instead of like using it when we didn't clip it, this limiter was getting driven by that huge spike and squashing the whole waveform. Now we're only sort of like shaving the top of the waveform off, but we still lose LUFS. And also, I mean, clipping changes the harmonic content, like we can see in the spectrum analyzer. You can see how the spectrum changes as we engage the clipper. So, I mean, clipping is definitely a useful tool. I mean, you can use it on steady state waveforms. It's, I would say, more in a mixing mind frame, you'd use it more on like drum transients or something, where it's this really quick sound that you're shaving off. So this change in the frequency spectrum is not really noticeable because it's happening so quickly. You're not really able to perceive the frequency spectrum in that short of a time. But for these steady state waveforms, you're definitely changing it. So it's not that you also can't clip your waveforms, but just be aware that you're changing you're changing the sound of it when it's these steady state waveforms. So anyway, I guess the main point is that clipping and limiting both don't save us from this transient problem that we get from multiband dynamics. And I'm not saying that multiband dynamics is bad and that you can't use it, but you should be aware that it's going to change the shape of your waveform. So yeah, I guess the last thing I want to do is talk about like why does multiband dynamics change the shape of the waveform, and like why is this not optimal in the sense of clarity. So multiband dynamics is going to essentially adjust the phase of our the harmonics of our waveform. So different frequency content gets shifted, the phase gets shifted differently. So you kind of lose this nice optimal coherency we have in these basic shapes. And the square and the saw are already optimal. So like when we put those through this multiband dynamics, like we're always going to sort of get worse results. If you're not putting a square or saw in, like you might not already be optimal. So it might not really cause the same problems, or it might not be as noticeable. But it does help to like drive the point home of what this is doing to your signal. And like, I guess one way to show what multiband dynamics is doing is bring in a plugin that its whole job is to just disperse the harmonics or adjust the phase coherency of the harmonics. So there's disperser by kilohertz. And we can actually just set it up to pretty much simulate what multiband dynamics is doing, at least in the frequency splitting sense. So, I mean, I guess like we'd want to just start this out around the same frequency splits as multiband dynamics is set up for. So let's do like 120. And see what that does to the waveform. And then multiband dynamics also has an upper split at 2.5. Oops. Let's see. 2.5 kilohertz. So yeah, just kind of using our oscilloscope to tune things. These two dispersers are basically simulating what multiband dynamics is using. And hey, I mean, disperser is a plugin for a reason. Some people like the sound of like dispersed harmonics, but just be aware what it's doing to your signal. And I also wanted to show this just because if we bring in just a completely different chain, let's actually go into phase plant. Because we can show what dispersion does across different levels, just to kind of show it's not just those particular settings of multiband dynamics or disperser that give you those sharp peaks. It's really kind of like any dispersion on a square or saw wave that gives you those sharp peaks, which just kind of drives the point home that squares and saws are awesome. They're pretty optimal. So if we bring in a wavetable and let's do a new waveform with, let's do the square first. And if we are to, let's just do full screen. If we were to add this dispersion effect in the wavetable and kind of vary the amount from like no dispersion all the way to full dispersion. And then across all of these frames, we were to normalize, I guess we could do the RMS. So it's like the loudness. So we're saying like the loudness is the same on all frames. Now, what is the, how much headroom do you have? And you can see that we're always going to have less headroom than just like the square. So I guess the best way to see is like this square is right around this line of like, in phase plant they call it like minus 25. It's like minus 29% or whatever they call it in phase plant. But if you go across this, like every single waveform is going to exceed that minus 29%. So you have less headroom in all of these frames for the same loudness. And this is also true of the sawtooth. So if we were to start over and put just a sawtooth in this, and then we were to disperse that, we're kind of sweeping this through 0 dispersion all the way to 100%. Now the sawtooth is peaking at 100%. Oh, right, and that's why we're at like 29 because we're going to normalize the loudness of all these frames, and we're always going to have less headroom. So this is like also around 29-ish%, and every single like setting of this disperser is always, actually, was this one? No, so this one over here you have less peak, but over here it does exceed the minus 29. So you have less headroom all the way across all these dispersion settings. And you can check that yourself if you don't believe me. But essentially like the phase relationship between all the harmonics is optimal for saws and squares. So that's really the point I want to drive home, is just that be mindful of which plugins are changing your wave shape to introduce these sharp peaks. They can be affecting how much loudness you can get out of your individual waveforms. There's a couple ways you can deal with it with clipping and limiting, but it's really never as optimal as just, keeping that phase coherency where you're not getting those sharp peaks. And I guess the last point is just that saws and squares are awesome. Like, it's not that you only have to use them, but like it's a good idea to sort of stay in that like shape of squares and saws where you are not getting those really sharp peaks, and the peak of your waveform is like not so far away from the average amplitude of your waveform. And I know it's kind of a complicated topic, so if you have any questions, let me know. Also, I think waveform clarity is a pretty complicated subject, and I really just focused on like loudness and headroom. So if you have any other thoughts of like other aspects of clarity in your waveforms, let me know in the chat. I'd be really interested to talk about that. And if you want to see more deep dives like that, just follow my channel. I'm always planning on making more music content like this. Thanks for watching.